first guest speaker, who is Leslie Gilham. And Leslie is the chair of the Breast Cancer Trials Consumer Advisory Panel. And Leslie is joining us from Melbourne tonight. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
Good. Leslie, if we can start off by asking, when and how did you find out that you had breast cancer?
So it was back in 2009, and at that stage I didn't have any sort of knowledge really about breast cancer other than a girlfriend of mine was having some screening done, and she wanted me to go along and I guess hold her hand a bit. She was a bit concerned, and all her tests actually turned out okay. But it wasn't until sort of later in that week that I thought I hadn't really been proactive in that space myself. So I actually did a self-examination and found a thickening in my breast tissue, and then obviously booked an appointment with my GP to follow up on it. So once I went to my GP, she didn't think it was anything of concern either because I was considered young at the time, which was 46. But we went ahead with the screening, and unfortunately it came back as a positive diagnosis.
And did you have any family history of breast cancer before that diagnosis?
No, like I said, at that stage I didn't have any awareness of a family history at all, but it wasn't until probably about almost 6 months later my sister was diagnosed with a different type of breast cancer, but still breast cancer the same, and we started to investigate a bit further, and my dad, who'd passed away some years before from what we thought was prostate cancer, also had breast cancer at the time, and then further investigation we found a few more cousins as well. So there is a strong family history. We're not BRCA, we're inconclusive, but there's a clear sort of, I guess, genetic path there somewhere.
Yeah. So at what point did you hear about clinical trial?
So I guess it was probably my first, I'd met with my surgeon, and then I was lucky because it was 2009 and they weren't as common as what they are now with a multidisciplinary team. So my surgeon had spoken to my oncologist who had actually said there was a clinical trial. So she sort of flagged it, and then when I met with my oncologist, he said that it would be possible for me to participate if I was interested. So I guess it was probably a bit of a joint thing between the surgeon and the oncologist.
Yeah. So what were some of the deciding factors that made you want to participate in a trial?
I guess from my perspective, I've always been a volunteer. I've volunteered in all sorts of aspects of my life, and I guess the other important factor for me was I've got a daughter. So I guess I really wanted to do whatever I could to make hopefully like a diagnosis for future generations a little bit better.
Yeah. So when you're actually on the trial and you say, yes, I'd like to participate, what's involved? Like how many appointments do you have? What did treatment involve? How long were you on the trial?
Yeah. So once the oncologist had mentioned the trial to me, he gave me all the information that I needed with informed consent documents, protocol, that sort of thing. And then I went away to read through that and discuss it with family and that sort of thing. So I had about, I guess, 48 hours to decide, because I had to decide before I'd started treatment. And the trial I was on was a randomised trial, so I wasn't guaranteed that I was going to get be put on the trial arm, but fortunately for me I was. And so the trial itself involved probably extra visits to clinic, quite significant extra visits really compared to standard of care, but for me that was a good thing because I found that very supportive, and I sort of became a bit more like a part of the furniture, I guess. It involved extra screening, so I had access to an MRI, which I might not have had if I wasn't on trial. There's a few extra bloods that had to be drawn. There was a lot of focus on cardiology, which I think is really important, so I had ECGs. But I guess probably, like I mentioned earlier, the important part was the supportive care aspect of the trial. So I had more visits, I had more access to not just my breast care nurse and my oncologist, but a research nurse, and just that whole quality of life was a real strong focus. Originally, follow-up the actual treatment phase was 5 years, and then I had 10 years of follow-up, but that's actually been pushed out to 15 years, which means that once a year now I'm contacted to just sort of fill in quality of life questionnaires and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So when the trial was complete, how did you find out the results of the trial?
So the whole way through my participation, I was kept updated when things were published, because it was an international trial, so there was things being published quite often. The lead chair in Australia was actually based in Melbourne, but I was kept up to date by my my oncologist and my research nurse anytime there was something that had been published as to how the trial was going. And then once the trial was finished, I was advised in a written letter about the results of the trial and that sort of thing. And the results were really good, and it's actually now standard of care, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, that is, yeah. So was participating in the trial the catalyst for you wanting to become an active consumer in research?
I think so. I think having been involved in the trial and seeing, one, what was involved in the trial, but just the amount of work that researchers were doing around the world to improve outcomes for breast cancer patients, it really sort of stoked something in me that I wanted to become a part of that world and see if I could give back somehow to the research community.
Well, you've come a long way since then. I think you're now the chair of the Breast Cancer Trials Consumer Advisory Panel. Can you explain what that committee does?
Yeah, so the Consumer Advisory Panel was established well over 20 years ago, and it was established by breast cancer trials because they thought it was very important to have a consumer voice or a patient voice at the table when it came to research, and I commend them for that because it's really important. So the committee is made up of a group of advocates who have all participated on a clinical trial and had a diagnosis of breast cancer. And what we're involved in is like every aspect of the organisation. So to ensure that, I guess, that the patient's voice is always at the forefront of the research and the researchers' minds. So not only do we advocate for involvement in clinical trials, but we also are involved in the development from the concept stage, so a development of a new trial. So we're participating in that. We review protocols, informed consent documents, which are really important, getting the message across about what is this particular clinical trial in lay terms. And the organisation values our input so much. We've got members on the Scientific Advisory Committee. We're associate investigators on trial committees. And then we also do things like media and fundraising just to raise awareness and I guess, about the importance of clinical trials throughout our communities.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of questions that have come through, particularly from people who don't have a medical background. Mm-hmm. And we've got a question from Victoria, and she has asked, what are some of the ways that consumers can contribute or become advocates for clinical trials?
Well, first off, I'd say you don't have to have a medical background. I think it's really important to bring the patient voice, so you don't need to bring the scientific voice to the table. So that's, I guess, what our specialty is. But I guess some of the ways that you could be involved, we run an impact program throughout BCT, so that's improving participation and advocating for clinical trials. So what that is that's at the moment involved. It sort of runs jointly with the scientific meeting every year, and it's basically a way of educating people that are interested in the science and what research is happening around the world in clinical trials in breast cancer. So I'd recommend that one. You could share posts from breast cancer trials on your social media and throughout your networks. Researchers often work with consumers on grant applications, so that's another avenue where you could become involved and just start to work in research. And that happens all around both Australia and New Zealand. And the important thing is, I think, for clinical trials, and like Anna touched on earlier about it's a strong focus at the moment because of COVID, is you can share information about what breast cancer trials are doing throughout your networks and what trials are out there. And I guess if there is an opportunity, you can do media and you could be involved that way through breast cancer trials and do media in your area about clinical trials. And if there is anyone out there who's interested and wants to become more involved, we actually have vacancies on our Consumer Advisory Panel at the moment. So if that's something that may be of interest to you, please don't hesitate to contact either Anna or myself, and we can send you out all the information and to see if you might be wanting to progress that a bit further.
Yeah, if anyone who's watching was interested at all, if you sent an email to media@bctrials.org.au, we can manage any inquiries from there. We have a question from Elizabeth, and Elizabeth has asked, and I think this goes to the heart of some of the things that you've done, Leslie, as a consumer. How I would like to tell my story to help others. How can my story make a difference?
Well, I think in the area of research, it can make a huge difference. One of the roles that the Consumer Advisory Panel plays is making sure that researchers and people in the broader community, I guess, realise that what they're asking from people to participate in a clinical trial, that it sort of brings that sort of face to the table. So, you sort of bring that whole, telling your story sort of really brings people back to earth a bit, and sort of realises that, one, you're not the only one out there, but two, it really puts a face to the research. And I remember being approached by someone who actually just runs a lab. So we're talking about research with, just looking through microscopes, I guess, to use simple terms. But they even had me come to talk to their researchers at that level, just to realise, I guess, to sort of inspire those people looking through those microscopes that the work they're doing will end up benefiting hopefully someone like myself or others in the community. So it sort of breaks down that barrier, I guess, about, from people just doing the research but connecting with patients as well.
Yeah, that's so important. Well, thank you very much, Leslie. That was really good information. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for having me.